now is human rights attorney and director of the film The Making of a Martyr, a journey into the world of a child suicide bomber, Brooke Goldstein. Brooke, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, Brooke, I want to get right into this. You saw that video, heard the introduction. It's absolutely tragic. The little boy was clearly a child, not even to puberty yet, certainly not an adult. Why is ISIS using child soldiers?
They're using them for several reasons. Number one, it is an intentional strategy. It is not a sign of desperation. We have seen Islamist terrorist groups use children as child soldiers, as human shields, as suicide bombers for the last 15 plus years. They're easily indoctrinated, they're easily manipulated, and the whole point of terrorism is to instill fear. And as you pointed out in your introduction, that, you know, the child bomber, obviously the goal is to kill the child, but the target is also children. The target is innocent women and children and men. And that is the point of the Islamist terror attack, to instill fear, to instill terror. And children, for example, are drugged when they're used. They are detonated by remote control. Children are now being recruited directly from their families. They're paying up to $12,000 per child, for example, in Afghanistan. So it's an intentional strategy, but also remember, ISIS is trying to indoctrinate the next generation. For them, this is a 100+ year battle. I mean, we think just now. They're thinking generations to come. They call them the Cubs, as you mentioned, because they want to indoctrinate future jihadis to establish the caliphate.
Right. The Cubs of the Caliphate. That reminds me of the Hitler Youth. It's so awful. Now, is there an access component to their choice to use child suicide bombers? Because you said it's not desperation, that children are more susceptible to propaganda. They follow orders better. They might take drugs in order to be numb to the idea that they're walking to their deaths. Is this an access issue in the sense that, like we saw in Turkey, this boy just walked into the wedding sort of unsuspecting because he was a child?
Right, exactly. I mean, that's one advantage, so to speak, of having a child. They're not expected. But again, it is an intentional strategy. And we're seeing, for example, in every Muslim majority country, there is a systemic indoctrination process through the media. You have, satellite companies like Eutelsat, which is basically French-based, Nowsat, Egyptian-based, Arabsat, Saudi Arabia-based. At one time or another, all of them have broadcasted terror media that specifically target children and teach them to kill the infidel. And now what we're seeing in Europe, for example, in Germany and Hanover this past February, a 15-year-old girl was inspired by ISIS internet propaganda. She was a self-starter, what people call a lone wolf, went and stabbed a police officer. We see the same thing happening all over Israel, where children as young as 13 years old are taking it upon themselves because of the extent of the brainwashing and indoctrination to carry out these murderous attacks.
Right, and like you said, this isn't isolated in the Middle East either. There was a separate incident just a couple weeks ago. Iraqi forces faced off with that boy. We saw it in the video that was wearing a suicide belt. He later told interrogators, though, and this is the part I thought was more interesting, he told interrogators that he was forced to wear that he didn't want to, and he was forced by ISIS operatives to do so. He was kidnapped by masked men, apparently beforehand. Is that the truth, in your opinion, or is that a lie they would have told him to tell if he was caught?
Well, could be either. I mean, look, you have to look at each example of a child recruited on a case-by-case basis. Each child has a unique story. There are reports of parents voluntarily giving up their children. There are reports of children being kidnapped. There are reports of children being given bags of explosives, for example, by Hamas. They're not told what's in those explosives. In the bag, they don't know that they're going to be detonated. A child as young as 6 years old in Afghanistan was told to wear a belt, and he was told if he pressed a button, it would explode flowers. And in all of his innocence, that 6-year-old child went up to coalition force soldiers and said, I forget where to press. So each story is unique depending on the child. What is the common thread is that this is child abuse. This is premeditated murder. This is the most egregious war crime that could possibly be committed, because you are destroying the future for these children. And that's one question that we have to ask ourselves when defeating ISIS, which we will defeat ISIS. What do we then do with all of these children, 1,500 in total estimated, who have been recruited and indoctrinated and brainwashed?
Right, because like you said, they are being groomed to be the next generation of ISIS fighters. Brooke, we're almost out of time, but let me ask you this. How do we stop this? How do we stop ISIS indoctrinating children? How do we stop parents of little children selling their kids for suicide bombers or allowing them or encouraging them or what have you? How do we stop it?
Well, first of all, we have to defeat the terrorist groups who are doing this and defeat them in their entirety. Number two, we have to call this out for what it is. It is theologically motivated terrorism. When you interview these children and you ask them, why were you told to carry out this attack, or why do you want to seek so-called martyrdom? They all say because of religious reasons. This is theologically motivated Islamist terrorism. We have to talk about it in order to understand the threat. And third, we have to stop funding it. We have to stop funding United Nations schools that teach from textbooks provided by terrorist groups, for example, in the West Bank, where terrorists go and recruit directly from UN schools that we pay for the future child soldiers and suicide bombers. The EU has to stop funding the Palestinian Authority that airs cartoons and television programs that also target children and teach them to become suicide homicide bombers. So we're complicit in this as well.
Right, we have to stop funding it here, too, in the United States. We have to stop funding groups that are essentially offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood who plant the seeds of this Islamist ideology in children's heads so that they become vulnerable when they're teenagers, too. Brooke, very interesting topic. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your expertise. It was great to talk to you.